Mexico, 1952nd decade. In an arid region of the Bajío where dust covers the graves as if wanting to hide history, four sisters built an empire of death behind a smile of hospitality. They promised work, they promised food, they promised an opportunity, but what they offered was a cell without a key, screams muffled by fear, and a destiny sealed underground. For more than a decade, dozens of women were kidnapped, enslaved, and murdered, without anyone, neither the church, nor the police, nor the neighbors daring to intervene. How many times is silence more complicit than the killer? Leave us your opinion in the comments, and subscribe to discover the real stories that Mexico didn't want to tell. To understand how four women managed to kill en masse without firing a single bullet, we must return to the cursed ranch and open the first grave. When police agent Jose Martinez first stepped onto the Loma del Ángel ranch on that the 14th of January, 1964, the first thing he noticed wasn't the smell of death that he would later describe in his report, it was the silence. A thick silence that seemed to swallow even the sound of his own footsteps as he advanced through the backyard of that apparently normal property on the outskirts of San Francisco del Rincón, Guanajuato. What Agent Martinez didn't know was that he was entering what the Mexican press would soon call the Poquianchis slaughterhouse, a place where terror had reigned for almost 15 years, where death had women's names: Delfina, Maria de Jesus, Carmen, and Maria Luisa González Valenzuela. The ranch was dusty, with simple adobe and tile buildings. Nothing indicated the horror it kept beneath that dry earth. The officers had arrived, following the desperate testimony of Catalina Ortega, a young woman who had managed to escape just a few days before. "There are more," she had said through tears, "many more, buried like dogs." The González Valenzuela sisters weren't born monsters. Their story begins in El Salto, Jalisco, in a family marked by violence. Their father, Isidro Torres, was a police officer of the Porfirian government, a sheriff with alcoholism problems who didn't spare brutality against his own family. According to testimonies from neighbors who would later testify at the trial, Isidro forced his little daughters to witness the torture and execution of prisoners. "This is how you control people," he would tell them, while the bodies of the villagers writhed in the gallows. With fear. Fear is power. It was a lesson the sisters would never forget. Their mother, Bernardina Valenzuela, was a deeply religious woman who tried to counteract her husband's cruelty with prayers and promises of divine redemption. But each night, while the blows resonated on the adobe walls of the family home, the prayers seemed increasingly hollow. The sisters grew up in this brutal contrast, violence as a tool of control and religion as a mask of normalcy. Delfina, the eldest of the sisters, born on the 31st of December, 1909, inherited her father's cold and calculating intelligence. Maria del Carmen, born in 1913, had a skill for numbers and organization. Maria Luisa, Ava la Pianuda, Ava the Long-Legged, as she would later be called, was born on the 27th of August, 1912, and was known for her beauty and seductive capacity. Maria de Jesus, the youngest, born in 1924, learned from childhood to follow her older sisters without question. When their father died, the sisters received a small inheritance. With that money and the experience of having worked in a textile factory, they decided to start their own business. It was 1945. Mexico was undergoing profound changes after World War II. In rural areas, poverty pushed many young women to seek opportunities in larger cities. The González Valenzuela sisters saw an opportunity in this situation. They opened their first cantina in El Salto, Jalisco, a modest establishment where they hired waitresses who, under coercion, also offered sexual services. They soon learned that the real business wasn't in selling alcohol but women, and to maximize profits, they had to eliminate any possibility of these women escaping or demanding rights. The trick, Delfina would explain years later in one of her rare statements to the press, is to get the police first, then the clients, and then the girls. And so they did. With meticulous precision, the sisters built a network of complicity with local authorities. They offered free services, paid substantial bribes, and cultivated close relationships with corrupt officials. Their method of operation was perfected over the years. They hired recruiters, men who traveled through remote villages looking for vulnerable young women. They promised them well-paid work as domestic servants or waitresses in respectable restaurants. Some were even offered marriage. Others were simply kidnapped. Between 1950 and 1964, their network of brothels expanded. They opened establishments in Lagos de Moreno, Jalisco, and in San Francisco del Rincon, Guanajuato. Their businesses had innocuous names like La Barça de Oro or El Guadalajara, and from the outside looked like common cantinas or guest houses. The nickname Las Poquianchis came from the original owner of one of these places, but would soon become synonymous with terror. The business was implacably efficient. The captured young women, mostly between 12 and 15 years old, were transported to the brothels where their documents and belongings were taken away. They were informed that they had contracted a debt for transportation, lodging, and food that they had to pay by working. This debt, constantly manipulated, became unpayable. The first day in the brothel always followed the same pattern. The young women were brutally beaten to break any resistance. Then they were raped, sometimes by several men to train them in their new trade. Any escape attempt was punished with public torture to serve as an example to the others. They beat us with boards, with sticks, with whatever they had at hand. One of the survivors would relate years later. If one cried too much, they stuffed rags in her mouth until she choked. I saw many die like that. The Poquianchis ensured that health authorities issued false medical control cards documents certifying that the young women were free of venereal diseases. These documents cost a lot of money, but they reassured clients and maintained the facade of legality. By 1955, the business was so prosperous that the sisters bought the Loma del Ángel ranch in Purísima del Rincón, Guanajuato. This property, apparently destined to be a country house, would become the scene of their worst atrocities. The ranch had several functions: as a place of punishment for women who disobeyed, as a retreat for those who became pregnant and could no longer work temporarily, and as a clandestine cemetery for those who died from diseases, mistreatment, or direct executions. The residents of San Francisco del Rincón and Purísima del Rincón noticed strange things: cars arriving at night, screams that were abruptly silenced, inexplicable smells on hot days, but no one said anything. The Poquianchis were powerful, had influential friends, and didn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who got in their way. Everyone here knew. A neighbor would confess years later to the newspaper Alarma, but it was as if they had made a pact of silence. Even the parish priest, when people commented something to him, said that one shouldn't meddle in other people's affairs. In the dusty roads connecting the towns of the Mexican Bajío, a well-dressed man drives an American car. It's 1958, and the contrast between his shiny vehicle and the humble adobe houses on the sides of the road couldn't be more marked. This man has a name, but for the González Valenzuela sisters, he's simply the recruiter, his job. To travel through impoverished villages, looking for the merchandise that feeds the Poquianchis' business, vulnerable young women, preferably between 12 and 15 years old. We look for girls that no one will miss. One of these recruiters would explain years later during the trial: orphans, daughters of single mothers, girls who already had problems at home. The most desperate were the easiest to convince. The recruitment method was always the same. The recruiter presented himself in the villages as a prosperous merchant or representative of a wealthy city family. He visited the plazas during market days, talked with the locals, discreetly asked about families with many children or young women who wanted to improve their situation. Once the potential prey was identified, calculated courtship began. For the teenagers, he promised dignified jobs as domestic servants, waitresses, or shop assistants in respectable stores in big cities like León, Guadalajara, or even Mexico City. He spoke of salaries that sounded astronomical to these peasant girls: 300 pesos a month, when the average salary in the countryside barely reached 100. He told me that the lady he worked for needed a girl to help with the children. Maria Jimenez, one of the survivors, would remember. He promised that I would have my own room, complete meals, and Sundays off. For a 4-year-old girl who slept on the floor with 5 more siblings, it sounded like a dream. Sometimes the deception included romantic proposals. The recruiters presented themselves as bachelors looking for a wife, courted the young women for weeks, and finally proposed that they accompany them to the city to meet their family before the wedding. Other times, they negotiated directly with the parents, offering money to hire their daughters. My dad received 500 pesos. Josefina Lopez would count through tears during the trial. He told me it was an opportunity, that I should send money when I could. I never imagined, never thought. The day of departure was always charged with expectations. The young women, with their scarce belongings packed in cloth bags or cardboard boxes, said goodbye to their families with the promise of sending money soon. The parents, although fearful, saw in this opportunity an escape valve from the crushing poverty that surrounded them. The journey to the Poquianchis' brothels was the last stretch of freedom these young women would experience, although they didn't know it yet. During the trip, the recruiters maintained the facade, talking animatedly about the life awaiting them, describing luxurious houses and generous employers. He bought me a soda and candy on the way. Catalina Ortega would remember. He told me that Senora Delfina was very good, that she treated her employees like daughters, that I could learn to read if I wanted. The reality awaiting these young women couldn't be more different. Upon arrival at their destination, whether it was the La Barça de Oro bar in Lagos de Moreno, the El Guadalajara brothel in San Francisco del Rincon, or any of the other establishments controlled by the sisters, the deception was revealed with brutal speed. The first contact with the Poquianchis marked the beginning of terror. Delfina, the eldest sister and undisputed leader, usually received the new acquisitions. Tall, robust in build, and always dressed in black, her presence commanded respect and fear. The first time I saw her, a survivor would say, I thought she was the owner of the house where I was going to work. She spoke to me kindly, offered me something to eat, then told me to rest, that we would talk about my duties the next day. That night, I slept peacefully. It was the last time I did. The awakening the next day was brutal. The young women were informed of their true situation. They hadn't been hired as domestic servants or waitresses, but as prostitutes. They were explained that they had contracted a debt for the trip, food and lodging, and that they had to pay it with their work. This debt, constantly manipulated, became unpayable. The natural reaction was resistance, and here is where the Poquianchis system showed its calculated cruelty. Any refusal was responded to with an exemplary beating, frequently administered by Maria de Jesus, the youngest of the sisters, who compensated for her inferior position in the family hierarchy with special brutality toward the captives. She beat us with boards, with belt buckles, with whatever she had at hand, a survivor would explain, and while she did it, she repeated, "Here you do what we say, or you die. You choose." After the initial beating came the rape, usually at the hands of men who worked for the sisters, like El Águila Negra, the Black Eagle, an ex-military man, and Delfina's lover known for his brutality. This act wasn't just sexual aggression, but an initiation ritual designed to break any resistance. After that, a victim would relate, "I was no longer the same person. It was as if something inside me had died." To complement physical control, the Poquianchis employed psychological manipulation techniques. They completely isolated the young women, prohibiting them from communicating with the outside world. They confiscated any identity documents. They convinced them that after having been prostituted, their families would never accept them back, and they created divisions among them, granting small privileges to some so they would watch and denounce others. They made us believe we had nowhere to go. A survivor would explain that if we tried to escape, they would find us and kill our families, and after seeing what happened to those who tried to flee, we believed it. The victim profile reveals the perverse calculation behind the Poquianchis' system. The vast majority were teenagers, some barely leaving childhood, selected not only for their physical appearance, but for their social vulnerability. They came almost exclusively from extremely poor families, often from isolated indigenous or peasant communities. Many were illiterate, which made them more manipulable and made it difficult for them to understand their legal situation or their rights. Almost all lacked solid support networks. They were orphans, daughters of single mothers, or came from abusive homes they were already seeking to escape from. They chose the most vulnerable. An investigator would later affirm, girls who were already so desperate that any promise, however improbable it seemed, appeared better than their reality. The dawn in the Poquianchis' brothels didn't bring hope, only the beginning of another cycle of degradation. For the captive women, each new day was identical to the previous one, a routine carefully designed to break any vestige of humanity or resistance. They woke us at 10 in the morning. Juana Flores, one of the survivors, would relate. We had half an hour to wash with cold water, put on makeup, and dress as they ordered. If we took longer, they punished us by taking away the day's food. The physical facilities of the brothels revealed the calculated cruelty of the system. In El Guadalajara, one of the main brothels in San Francisco del Rincon, the women slept crammed in a back room without ventilation, with dirty mattresses thrown on the floor. The walls, painted a faded red, were marked with stains whose origin no one wanted to investigate. The bathroom was a communal latrine that was rarely cleaned. To wash, they had a cold water tap and a bucket. There was no privacy, no dignity. Every aspect of the environment was designed to reinforce their condition as merchandise, not human beings. The place smelled of humidity, sweat, and that cheap perfume they forced us to use. Another survivor would remember, a smell I've never been able to forget. I still wake up at night believing I'm breathing it. The food reflected the economic logic of the business, the minimum necessary to keep them alive and functioning. Breakfast was usually watery coffee and stale bread. The main meal, served in mid-afternoon, generally consisted of beans occasionally accompanied by rice or tortillas. If a client had paid well the night before, sometimes they gave us a piece of meat. Catalina Ortega would recount. It was their way of rewarding us, like giving a cookie to a dog that has obeyed. Women who fell ill received even less. They said that if we didn't work, we didn't deserve to eat. A survivor would explain, I saw companions faint from hunger while the sisters dined on chicken and meat. At 4 in the afternoon, preparation for the night began. The Poquianchis or their assistants inspected each woman, ensuring their appearance was adequate to attract clients. The makeup had to be abundant to hide both the extreme youth of some and the signs of mistreatment in others. They painted us like clowns, a victim would remember. Bright red lips, excessive rouge. If Senora Delfina didn't like how we looked, she made us wash our faces and start over, sometimes up to 3 or 4 times. The brothels opened their doors around 8 at night. The clients were mainly local workers, passing truckers, and occasionally businessmen or officials from nearby cities. The latter received preferential treatment and had access to private rooms and the youngest girls. Each woman had to serve between 10 and 20 clients per night. They had no right to refuse anyone regardless of their state of drunkenness, hygiene, or what they wanted to do. Any complaint resulted in immediate physical punishment. There was a client who came every week and enjoyed hurting us. A survivor would relate with a trembling voice. We all feared him. When he arrived, we prayed for him to choose another. If we complained to the sisters, they laughed and said it was part of the job. The money never passed through the women's hands. Clients paid directly to Carmen, the sister in charge of finances, or to the guards. The rates varied according to the service and the apparent age of the victim, but none of them saw a cent of that money. They told us everything went to our account, a survivor would explain, that we were paying the debt of the trip, food, clothes, even the makeup they put on us. But the debt never decreased, only grew. The control system within the brothels was as sophisticated as it was ruthless. The Poquianchis had perfected a regime of terror that combined physical violence, psychological manipulation, and the deliberate creation of an atmosphere of distrust among the captives. Physical punishments were routine and public, designed both to subjugate the victim and to terrorize the others. Minor infractions taking too long with a client, not smiling enough, showing signs of illness were punished with slaps, pinches, or hair pulling. More serious offenses trying to communicate with the outside, rejecting a client, attempting to escape merited brutal beatings. They beat us with everything they had at hand. A survivor would remember. Sticks, belts, electrical cables. Sometimes they used the belt buckle. Other times, when they were really furious, they heated spoons on the stove and burned our arms or bellies. These punishments were usually administered by Maria de Jesus, the youngest sister, or by El Aguila Negra and other men who worked for them. Delfina, as matriarch of the clan, generally didn't participate directly in the violence, preferring to give orders and observe. Delfina would look at you with those cold eyes while they beat you, a victim would say. She didn't scream, showed no emotion, just observed as if she were calculating how much more you could endure before breaking completely. For infractions considered extreme, there were special punishments: confinement in dark rooms without food or water for days, forced baths in ice water in the middle of winter, forcing the punished to remain standing all night, and if she collapsed from exhaustion, waking her with blows. They tied Lucia, a girl from Michoacan who tried to escape, to a chair and put out cigarettes on her arms, one after another. A witness would relate, "I counted the screams. There were 17. After that, she never tried to flee again. After that, she didn't speak at all." But perhaps more effective than physical terror was psychological control. The Gonzalez Valenzuela sisters had developed a system that completely dehumanized their victims, destroying their self-esteem and sense of identity. They constantly repeated that they were worthless, that they were whores no one would miss if they disappeared. They told us our families had forgotten us, that they would despise us if they knew what we were doing. A survivor would remember, and after a while we began to believe it. By 1955, the business was so prosperous that the sisters bought the Loma del Ángel ranch in Purísima del Rincón, Guanajuato. This property would become the scene of their worst atrocities, serving multiple functions: as a place of punishment for disobedient women, as a retreat for those who became pregnant, and as a clandestine cemetery. At the beginning of the 1962nd, when federal authorities began pressuring to close illegal brothels, the Poquianchis moved most of the women to the Loma del Ángel ranch, where they kept them practically as prisoners. The conditions at the ranch were inhuman. The women slept crammed in rooms without ventilation. Food was scarce and often spoiled. Punishments became more severe, and when a woman became seriously ill or was no longer useful for the business, she simply disappeared. At the ranch, there were no pretenses, a survivor would explain. They didn't have to pretend we were anything but prisoners. There were no clients to impress, no facade to maintain. In the northern end of the Loma del Ángel ranch, under a solitary mesquite tree, began what investigators would later call the largest clandestine cemetery discovered in Mexico until then. An apparently normal stretch of land that, however, kept under its surface the remains of dozens of women and children. They weren't crimes of passion or fits of rage. The prosecutor in charge of the case would explain years later. It was a business matter. They eliminated inventory that was no longer profitable, like someone getting rid of defective merchandise. The murder methods employed by the Poquianchis revealed this cold rationality. They didn't seek to cause unnecessary suffering, although they didn't avoid it, but simply to solve a problem in the most efficient way possible. Most of the homicides were carried out using methods that didn't leave obvious marks: suffocation, poisoning, or simply letting the victims die of hunger, disease, or untreated infections. Sometimes it was as simple as stopping feeding them. One of the men who worked for the sisters and later testified in exchange for a reduced sentence would relate. They locked them in a back room and forgot about them for days. When they opened it again, there was no need to kill them. For direct executions, the preferred method was suffocation. 2 men held the victim, while a third pressed a pillow or wet rags against her face. It was quick, relatively silent, and left no obvious evidence, especially after the body had been buried for a while. They almost always did it at night. A survivor who had witnessed several murders would remember. They took the girl from the common room, saying she had a special client. We knew they were lying because they took her toward the back, not toward the entrance. No one said anything. We all prayed silently not to be next. Poisoning was another common technique. The sisters had access to various toxic substances through their contacts: strychnine, which caused convulsions and death by suffocation; arsenic, which caused violent vomiting and fatal dehydration; or simply high doses of sedatives mixed with alcohol that stopped breathing. They gave a special medicine to those who were very sick. A witness would recount. They said it would help them sleep, and they slept, of course, forever. The decision of who lived and who died followed strictly commercial logic. The main candidates for elimination were women who became seriously ill, especially with contagious diseases like tuberculosis; those who had lost their attractiveness due to age, scars from abuse, or simply because after years of mistreatment they could no longer fake the enthusiasm clients expected; the rebels, those who tried to escape or refused to submit even after repeated punishments; those who had seen or heard too much, witnessing murders or overhearing conversations, pregnant women who survived childbirth but were too weakened to return to work quickly. They had a clinical eye for detecting when a girl was no longer profitable, an investigator would explain, and when they made the decision, they executed it without hesitation or remorse. The process after murder was also meticulously planned. The bodies were buried in the ranch's backyard, in shallow graves, sometimes individual, others collective, depending on the frequency of deaths in a given period. To accelerate decomposition and make identification difficult in case of discovery, they sprinkled the bodies with quicklime before covering them with earth. One January night in 1964, taking advantage of her captor's carelessness, Catalina Ortega, a 2-3-year-old woman who had been kidnapped 3 years earlier, managed to escape from the ranch. Malnourished, beaten, and terrified, she walked for hours until reaching a road where a trucker picked her up and took her to Leon. There, gathering all her courage, she did what no one had dared to do in almost 2 decades. She denounced the Poquianchis. The agent who took her statement initially didn't believe her. The accusations seemed taken from a horror novel, but something in Catalina's eyes, in the precision of her details, and in the torture marks on her body convinced him to investigate. On the 14th of January, 1964, several agents arrived at the Loma del Ángel ranch. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. Inside the main house, they found 15 women in severe malnutrition, some barely conscious. In the back rooms, they found torture instruments, whips, chains, cattle branding irons that had been used on human flesh. But the worst was in the backyard. Following the indications of the rescued women, the police began to excavate, and under the ranch's dry earth, they found the true horror: mass graves filled with human remains, some recent, others already reduced to bones bleached by the lime. "We dug all night," Agent Martinez would later remember. With each shovelful, more remains appeared. Some were so small, they could only be babies. Delfina and Maria de Jesus were arrested that same day at the ranch. Maria Luisa was captured days later, trying to flee to Mexico City. Carmen had died years earlier, in 1949, victim of cancer. The news shocked Mexico. The newspaper Alarma dedicated special editions to the case with sensationalist headlines describing the sisters as witches, vampires, and monsters with women's faces. The photographs of the graves and rescued women appeared on the front page. The Loma del Ángel ranch, that dusty and apparently normal place, had been the grave of at least 91 people, according to official calculations. Some sources claim the real number could exceed 150 victims. Among the remains were identified women, some men, probably clients who had seen too much, and several babies, children of the exploited women who had been murdered at birth. The Poquianchis' empire of terror had come to an end, but questions remained. How could they operate for so long without being discovered? How many people knew and remained silent? What darkness in the human soul allows 4 women to become executioners of their own gender? The judicial process against the González Valenzuela sisters began in March 1964. The trial became an unprecedented media spectacle. Every day, hundreds of people crowded in front of the Irapuato courthouse, waiting for a glimpse of the monsters, as the press called them. Inside, the horror unfolded in detailed testimonies. One after another, the survivors narrated their experiences, the initial deception, the brutal revelation of their true situation, the years of systematic abuse, the deaths they had witnessed. The most shocking thing, the judge who presided over the case would remember, was the contrast between these broken women who trembled while giving their testimony and the absolute indifference of the accused. The sisters listened to accounts of unimaginable atrocities with the same expression one would listen to a weather report. The defense strategy of the Poquianchis was to deny any direct responsibility in the murders. They admitted to running houses of prostitution, but insisted that the women worked voluntarily. The deaths, according to their version, had been caused by natural diseases or had been committed by their employees without their knowledge or approval. "We were businesswomen," Delfina would declare from the stand. "We didn't have time to supervise every detail of the business. If our employees committed excesses, it was without our consent." This defense crumbled before the overwhelming evidence, the meticulous records that the sisters themselves had kept, where they noted casualties with dates and causes, The consistent testimonies of multiple witnesses who placed them giving direct murder orders, the forensic evidence showing a systematic pattern incompatible with isolated actions by subordinates. Particularly damning were Delfina's personal diaries found in a secret compartment in her room at the ranch. In them, with clinical coldness, she detailed punishments, tortures, and deaths, sometimes with comments that revealed not only knowledge but satisfaction. Today, R finally stopped causing problems. Read an entry from October 1962. It took longer than expected. Next time we'll have to be more efficient. After 6 months of testimonies and deliberations, the verdict was announced on the 20th of September, 1964. Delfina, Maria de Jesus, and Maria Luisa González Valenzuela were declared guilty of pandering, procuring, kidnapping, torture, and multiple qualified homicide. The sentence, 40 years in prison, the maximum penalty available in Mexico at that time, since the death penalty had been abolished. The González Valenzuela sisters would serve their sentences in Irapuato prison, where fate reserved different endings for them. Delfina, the mastermind behind the Empire of Terror, died on the 17th of October, 1968, just 4 years after her conviction. The official cause, a brain hemorrhage after a bucket full of cement fell on her head during renovation work in the prison. An accident, according to authorities. Poetic justice, according to many. Maria Luisa, known as Eva la Piernuda, spent 20 years in prison before dying of liver cancer on the 19th of November, 1984. According to prison reports, she had become deeply religious in her final years, spending hours praying and reading the Bible. Maria de Jesus, the youngest of the sisters, was the only one who lived to see freedom. Released in 1984 for good conduct in advanced age, she spent 5 years in anonymity in a small town in Jalisco, apparently repentant of her actions. She died in the mid-1992 in poverty and oblivion. The case of the Poquianchis left a deep mark on the Mexican collective conscience. It inspired numerous cultural works: Jorge Ibargüengoicoea's novel Las Muertes, Felipe Casal's film Las Poquianchis, songs, theatre plays, and decades later, documentaries and television series. Beyond the cultural impact, the case provoked changes in Mexican legislation related to human trafficking and procuring. Laws were toughened, stricter protocols were established to investigate reports of women's disappearances, and the first organizations dedicated specifically to combating sexual exploitation were created. It was a turning point. A women's rights activist would affirm years later. For the first time, Mexico had to face a reality that had existed in the shadows for too long, that women, especially the most vulnerable, could be treated as disposable merchandise in a system that valued economic profit above human life. However, for many observers, the most disturbing lesson of the case was never completely assimilated, that the real monster wasn't just the 4 sisters, but the network of complicity and indifference that surrounded them, the corrupt authorities, the clients who frequented the brothels knowing or suspecting the women's conditions, the neighbors who heard screams and chose not to intervene. The Poquianchis could operate for almost 2 decades. A criminologist who studied the case would conclude, not because they were particularly brilliant or powerful, but because they existed in a social context that placed little value on the lives of poor and vulnerable women. And that's a lesson that unfortunately remains relevant today. The Loma del Ángel ranch, scene of so many horrors, was eventually demolished by court order. Today, in its place are cultivated fields where nothing indicates the hell that once existed there. Local inhabitants, however, avoid the area, especially at night. They say voices are heard. A farmer from the region would comment, cries of women and babies, especially on moonless nights, as if the earth itself couldn't forget what happened in that place. For Catalina Ortega, whose courage made possible the end of the Poquianchis' empire of terror, life after the ranch was a difficult path. For years, she struggled against recurring nightmares, panic attacks, and profound distrust toward others. Eventually, she married, had children, and built a modest life far from San Francisco del Rincon. She rarely spoke of her past. "I don't want to be remembered only as a victim or as the one who escaped," she would say in her last known interview given to a journalist in 1984. "I want to be remembered as someone who, despite everything, managed to rebuild her humanity, because that's what they really wanted to destroy, not just our bodies, but our capacity to feel human." When she died in 2001, a small obituary in a local newspaper described her simply as a brave woman who faced evil and survived to tell the story. It was perhaps the most fitting epitaph for someone who had descended into hell and found the strength to return and close the doors behind her. The case of the Poquianchis remains in Mexican collective memory as a reminder of the depths human cruelty can reach, but also of the power of resistance and the importance of not remaining silent in the face of injustice. "What I learned," one of the survivors would say years later, "is that silence is the monster's best friend, and that sometimes the real monsters aren't supernatural creatures from legends, but ordinary people who make terrible choices day after day, protected by a society that prefers not to see." In the arid lands of Guanajuato, where dust covers all traces with time, the memory of the Poquianchis has become a somber warning, a bedtime story based on facts too real. A story that Mexico didn't want to tell, but that it finally had to hear, because as the case of the González Valenzuela sisters would demonstrate, sometimes the deepest horrors don't come from supernatural creatures or legendary monsters, but from the darkness that can grow in ordinary human hearts when power is exercised without restrictions, greed operates without limits, and society chooses to look the other way. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Poquianchis case wasn't just the magnitude of their crimes, but the extensive network of complicity that allowed their operation for nearly 2 decades. This wasn't simply a case of 4 evil women operating in isolation. It was a systemic failure that involved multiple levels of Mexican society. The most obvious accomplices were the corrupt officials and police who protected the Poquianchis' operation. Local police in San Francisco, Del Rincon, Lagos de Moreno, and surrounding areas regularly received bribes to ignore complaints or tip off the sisters about potential investigations. Some officers even became regular clients, receiving free services in exchange for their protection. The police were their best customers and their best protectors. One survivor would testify, "They came in uniform sometimes, showing off their authority. We knew that complaining to them would be useless, they were part of the system." Municipal authorities issued licenses for cantinas and guest houses despite knowing their true nature. Health inspectors certified the cleanliness of establishments where women were kept in subhuman conditions. Tax collectors overlooked suspicious financial activities in exchange for generous payments. One particularly damning example was Comandante Raúl Espinoza, the police chief of San Francisco del Rincon from 1955 to 1962. During the trial, it was revealed that he had received monthly payments of 2,000 pesos from the Poquianchis, more than his official salary, in exchange for ensuring their operations remained undisturbed. Espinoza wasn't just corrupt, the prosecutor would note. He was an active participant in the criminal enterprise. He helped select which complaints to ignore, which witnesses to intimidate, and which investigations to sabotage. Several doctors and medical practitioners were complicit in the Poquianchis' crimes. They issued false health certificates for the captive women, treated injuries without reporting obvious signs of abuse, and performed illegal abortions under dangerous conditions. Dr. Aurelio Mendoza, who practiced in San Francisco del Rincon, regularly visited the brothels to examine the women. According to testimony, he was fully aware of their captive status, but continued to provide services for substantial fees. He issued medical certificates declaring women free of venereal diseases when many were clearly infected, and he performed crude abortions that often resulted in death from complications. "The doctor was just another customer," one survivor testified. "He examined us like cattle, certified we were healthy when we were dying, and sometimes stayed for other services after his medical work was done." The Poquianchis maintained relationships with legitimate businesses that served as fronts for money laundering and as sources of supplies. Local shopkeepers sold them goods without questioning the quantities needed for their supposed guest houses. Butchers provided meat that may have included human remains mixed with animal products. Transportation companies moved women and supplies without asking questions. The client base included not just common workers and truckers, but also prominent members of local society. Businessmen, landowners, politicians, and even clergy members were among those who frequented the establishments. Many knew or suspected the true conditions of the women, but continued to patronize the brothels. "We served men from all walks of life," a survivor recalled. "Poor farmers and rich landowners, young men and grandfathers, single men and married men with families. They all knew we didn't want to be there, but they didn't care as long as they got what they came for." Perhaps most shocking was the complicity of silence from religious authorities. The Catholic Church, which held enormous influence in rural Mexico during the 1952nd and 1962nd, was aware of rumors about the Poquianchis, but chose not to investigate or speak out. Father Miguel Herrera, parish priest of San Francisco del Rincon from 1952 to 1965, later admitted that parishioners had approached him with concerns about the strange activities at the ranch and brothels. However, he claimed he was advised by church superiors not to involve himself in temporal matters and to focus on spiritual guidance. The church's silence was deafening. A local historian would later write, "Here was an institution that preached about protecting the innocent and helping the vulnerable, yet when faced with evidence of the most horrific crimes against young women, they chose to look away." Even more disturbing, the Poquianchis regularly attended Mass and made substantial donations to the church. Delfina was known to sit in the front pew during Sunday services, presenting herself as a devout Catholic businesswoman. The church accepted her donations without question, even using some of the money to repair the church roof and buy new religious artifacts. The broader community's complicity was perhaps the most tragic aspect of the case. Neighbors, shopkeepers, and ordinary citizens all contributed to the conspiracy of silence that allowed the Poquianchis to operate. In small towns like San Francisco del Rincon and Purísima del Rincon, everyone knew everyone else's business. The arrival of young women who were never seen leaving, the screams heard at night, the strange smells emanating from the ranch during hot weather, all of this was noticed, but never officially reported. "We all knew something wasn't right," admitted Esperanza Morales, who lived near the ranch, "but the Poquianchis were powerful, and people were afraid. They had money, connections, and weren't shy about making threats. It was easier to pretend we didn't see anything." Some community members actively participated in the cover-up. Local gravediggers helped dispose of bodies, construction workers built secret rooms and underground chambers, and farmers provided quicklime for corpse disposal. All were paid well for their silence and participation. The Poquianchis understood that maintaining their operation required not just fear, but also economic incentives. They systematically corrupted their local environment by becoming major economic players in their communities. They were among the largest employers in the region, providing jobs not just in their brothels, but in related businesses. They bought supplies from local merchants, hired local workers for construction and maintenance, and paid taxes, though fraudulently calculated, that contributed to municipal budgets. They were good for business. One local merchant would later admit, "They bought in large quantities, paid in cash, and didn't haggle over prices. Many families depended on their money, directly or indirectly." This economic dependence created a powerful incentive for the community to maintain the status quo. Exposing the Poquianchis would mean losing a major source of income for many families who were already struggling with poverty. The systematic targeting of specific types of victims reveals the calculated nature of the Poquianchis' operation and the social inequalities that made their crimes possible. Most victims came from the poorest regions of central Mexico, remote villages in Jalisco, Michoacán, Guanajuato, and Zacatecas, where economic opportunities were scarce and families struggled with extreme poverty. These areas were deliberately chosen because they were isolated, had poor communication with urban centers, and were populated by people with little political power or social connections. The Poquianchis specifically avoided targeting women from wealthy or well-connected families, understanding that such disappearances would prompt serious investigations. Instead, they focused on the most marginalized segments of Mexican society. The majority of victims were between 12 and 16 years old when they were captured. This wasn't coincidental. The Poquianchis knew that very young women commanded higher prices from clients, while also being easier to control and manipulate. Most came from large families where one less mouth to feed might actually provide economic relief to struggling parents. Many were already working as domestic servants, field laborers, or in other forms of child labor, making their transition to sexual slavery less noticeable to their communities. A disproportionate number of victims were indigenous or mestizo women from communities where Spanish was often a second language. This linguistic barrier made it even more difficult for them to seek help or communicate with authorities, even if they had been inclined to help. The racist attitudes prevalent in 1952 Mexico meant that the disappearance or abuse of indigenous women was often dismissed or ignored by authorities who might have acted if the victims had been from European-descended families. The Poquianchis deliberately targeted girls from broken homes, orphans, daughters of single mothers, children from abusive households, or those whose parents were absent due to work or abandonment. These young women had fewer people who would miss them and less likelihood of having their disappearances investigated. We looked for girls who were already invisible to society. One recruiter would testify, if nobody cared about them before we took them, nobody would care after they disappeared. The case of the Poquianchis raises disturbing questions about the nature of evil and how ordinary people can become capable of extraordinary cruelty. Psychological profiles developed during the trial painted Delfina as a classic psychopath, intelligent, manipulative, completely lacking in empathy, and capable of extreme violence without remorse. Her childhood exposure to violence and her father's lessons about power and control had shaped her into someone who saw other people as objects to be used for personal gain. Delfina didn't see the women as human beings. A psychiatrist who examined her would conclude, to her, they were inventory, no different from cattle or merchandise. She could order their deaths with the same emotional detachment that a factory manager might order the disposal of defective products. Her religious devotion wasn't hypocritical in her mind. She genuinely believed that God supported the strong and that her success proved divine approval of her actions. She saw her victims as morally inferior beings whose suffering was justified by their social status and circumstances. As the youngest sister, Maria de Jesus compensated for her lower status in the family hierarchy by being the most brutal in her treatment of victims. Psychologists identified classic signs of displaced aggression, unable to assert power over her older sisters. She took out her frustrations on the captive women. Maria de Jesus was the most sadistic. Survivors consistently reported she seemed to enjoy causing pain, not just as punishment but for its own sake. She would smile while beating us, as if our suffering gave her pleasure. Her psychology revealed someone who had been victimized by the family power structure and who recreated that dynamic by victimizing others even more vulnerable than herself. Maria Luisa's beauty and charm made her the perfect recruiter. She was able to present a trustworthy maternal face to potential victims while harboring complete indifference to their ultimate fate. Her psychology showed classic traits of narcissistic personality disorder, an inflated sense of self-importance, lack of empathy, and the ability to manipulate others for personal gain. Maria Luisa could make you believe she cared about you. One survivor remembered, she had this way of looking at you with such seeming kindness that you wanted to trust her, but behind those eyes was nothing, no real human feeling at all. Perhaps most disturbing was how normal the sisters appeared to outsiders. They weren't obviously deranged or visibly monstrous. They attended church, participated in community events, maintained social relationships, and presented themselves as successful businesswomen. This banality of evil, the concept that great atrocities can be committed by seemingly ordinary people, was exemplified in the Poquianchis case. Their ability to compartmentalize their criminal activities from their public personas allowed them to operate for years without arousing suspicion. They were your neighbors, your fellow parishioners, the women you'd nod to at the market. A social psychologist would observe, evil doesn't always announce itself with horns and fangs. Sometimes it comes dressed in Sunday clothes and carrying a donation for the church. The rescue of the survivors marked the beginning of a long and difficult process of healing and justice-seeking that would extend for decades. The 15 women found alive at the ranch required extensive medical treatment. Many were severely malnourished. with some weighing less than 80 pounds despite being adults. They suffered from various diseases: tuberculosis, syphilis, gonorrhea, and infections from untreated injuries. The psychological trauma was even more severe. Most exhibited symptoms of what would now be recognized as complex post-traumatic stress disorder: severe depression, anxiety, panic attacks, dissociation, and inability to trust others. Many had lost basic social skills after years of captivity. They had been so systematically dehumanized that they had to relearn how to be human beings, explained Dr. Carmen Sanchez, one of the psychiatrists who treated the survivors. Simple things like making choices about food or clothing were overwhelming to them after years of having every aspect of their lives controlled. Perhaps the most difficult challenge facing survivors was social reintegration. In 1962 Mexico, women who had been involved in prostitution even involuntarily faced severe social stigma. Many survivors found that their families and communities rejected them, viewing them as damaged goods or somehow complicit in their own victimization. "Society treated us like we were the criminals," one survivor would later recall. "People looked at us with disgust or pity, but never with the understanding that we were victims who needed help and support." Several religious organizations and women's groups attempted to provide support, offering safe housing, job training, and counseling. However, resources were limited, and many survivors struggled with poverty, mental health issues, and social isolation for the rest of their lives. While the conviction of the Poquianchis themselves provided some measure of justice, many survivors and advocates felt that the legal system failed to address the broader network of complicity that had enabled the crimes. Most of the corrupt officials, police officers, doctors, and other accomplices received only minor penalties or no punishment at all. The systematic corruption that had protected the Poquianchis for nearly 2 decades was largely ignored by the courts, which focused primarily on the sisters themselves. Justice was incomplete, argued lawyer Maria Elena Vasquez, who represented several survivors in civil proceedings. Punishing the Poquianchis was necessary but not sufficient. The system that enabled them continued to exist, which meant similar crimes could happen again. The impact extended beyond the direct victims to their families, who had often spent years wondering about their daughter's fate. Some families had believed their daughters were living successful lives in the city, occasionally receiving letters, actually forged by the Poquianchis, claiming all was well. The discovery of the crimes shattered these illusions and created complex feelings of grief, guilt, and anger. Parents questioned their decisions to let their daughters leave home, while siblings struggled with survivors' guilt and fear that they might have suffered similar fates. "My mother never recovered from learning what happened to my sister," recalled the brother of one victim. "She blamed herself for letting Maria go with those people, even though she had been trying to give her a better opportunity. The guilt ate her alive until the day she died." The Poquianchis case became a watershed moment in Mexican culture, forcing a national conversation about issues that had previously been ignored or suppressed. The case received unprecedented media coverage, with newspapers, magazines, radio stations, and early television programs dedicating extensive attention to every detail of the crimes. The newspaper Alarma broke sales records with its sensationalistic coverage, featuring graphic photographs and lurid headlines. This media attention served a dual purpose. It informed the public about the crimes and their scope, but it also sensationalized the violence in ways that sometimes bordered on exploitation. The survivors found themselves re-victimized by media coverage that focused more on the shocking details of their abuse than on their humanity and need for support. "The press treated our story like entertainment," one survivor complained. "They wanted all the gory details but showed little interest in helping us rebuild our lives or preventing similar crimes from happening to others." The case inspired numerous cultural works that attempted to process and understand the horror of what had occurred. Jorge Ibargüengoitia's novel Las Muertas, The Dead Women, provided a fictionalized but recognizable account of the crimes, while Felipe Casals' film Las Poquianchis brought the story to cinema audiences. These cultural productions served important functions. They kept the memory of the crimes alive. They provided a space for social reflection about the conditions that had enabled such atrocities, and they honored the memory of the victims. However, They also risked further sensationalizing the violence and exploiting the survivors' trauma for artistic purposes. The case contributed to gradual changes in Mexican social attitudes toward women, sexuality, and violence. It forced public acknowledgement that women and girls, particularly those from poor and indigenous backgrounds, were vulnerable to extreme forms of exploitation and violence. Women's rights organizations, though still limited in 1962nd Mexico, used the case to advocate for better protection of vulnerable women and girls. They pushed for legal reforms, better police training, and social programs to address the root causes of vulnerability that the Poquianchis had exploited. The case was a wake-up call, explained feminist historian Dr. Esperanza Tuñón. It made visible forms of violence and exploitation that had been occurring in the shadows for generations. It forced Mexican society to confront uncomfortable truths about how we treated our most vulnerable members. The Catholic Church's response to the case was complex and often contradictory. While condemning the crimes themselves, church leaders were reluctant to acknowledge their own failure to act on earlier warnings, or to address the broader social conditions that had enabled the atrocities. Some progressive clergy used the case as an opportunity to advocate for social justice and protection of the poor and vulnerable. They argued that the Church had a moral obligation to actively combat such evils rather than simply condemning them after the fact. However, conservative church elements focused primarily on the moral failings of individuals rather than systemic issues, arguing that the crimes were the result of personal sin rather than social dysfunction. This response frustrated advocates who wanted to address root causes rather than simply assign blame. The legacy of the Poquianchis case extends far beyond the immediate punishment of the perpetrators and support for survivors. It revealed fundamental problems in Mexican society that continue to resonate today. Despite legal reforms and increased awareness, many of the conditions that made the Poquianchis crimes possible persist in Mexico today. Rural poverty, limited educational opportunities for girls, weak law enforcement in remote areas, and social attitudes that devalue women and girls from marginalized communities continue to create vulnerability to exploitation and violence. Modern forms of human trafficking and sexual exploitation often follow patterns similar to those established by the Poquianchis, targeting vulnerable young women from poor, rural, or indigenous communities, using deception and false promises to recruit victims, employing violence and psychological manipulation to maintain control, and operating within networks of corruption and complicity. The specific horrors of the Poquianchis are historical, noted anti-trafficking activist Lydia Cacho, but the underlying dynamics that enabled their crimes are still with us. We've made progress, but we haven't solved the fundamental problems. The case did lead to some important institutional reforms. Police training was improved to better recognize and investigate human trafficking cases. Legal procedures were established to provide better protection for victims and witnesses. Social services were expanded to provide support for survivors of sexual violence and exploitation. However, these reforms were often incomplete or poorly implemented. Corruption remained a significant problem in many areas, and resources for victim support and crime prevention remained limited. The case demonstrated the need for comprehensive, sustained efforts to address complex social problems rather than quick fixes or superficial responses. Efforts to preserve the memory of the Poquianchis case and honor its victims have taken various forms. Memorials have been established, educational programs have been developed, and the case is now studied in criminology and sociology courses throughout Mexico. However, there has been ongoing debate about how to remember the case appropriately. Some argue for focusing on the horror and brutality to ensure such crimes are never repeated. Others advocate for emphasizing the resilience of survivors and the importance of social solidarity in preventing and responding to such atrocities. We need to remember not just the evil that was done, argued historian Dr. Ricardo Pérez Montfort, but also the courage of those who survived and those who finally spoke out. The lesson isn't just about human capacity for cruelty, but also about human capacity for resistance and moral action. The Poquianchis case remains relevant to contemporary discussions about human trafficking, gender-based violence, and social inequality in Mexico and beyond. Current anti-trafficking efforts in Mexico explicitly reference the Poquianchis case as a historical precedent that demonstrates both the devastating impact of trafficking crimes and the importance of comprehensive responses that address not just individual perpetrators but entire networks of complicity. Modern trafficking operations often employ similar tactics, targeting vulnerable populations, using deception and false promises for recruitment, employing violence and psychological manipulation for control, and operating within corrupt systems that provide protection from law enforcement. The Poquianchis were pioneers of industrial-scale human trafficking, observed criminologist Dr. Elena Azaola. Understanding their methods and the conditions that enabled them is essential for combating modern trafficking operations that use similar approaches. The case is also studied as an extreme example of gender-based violence and the particular vulnerabilities faced by women and girls in patriarchal societies. The way the Poquianchis were able to exploit gender norms and expectations, presenting themselves as respectable women offering legitimate opportunities to young girls, demonstrates how gender can be weaponized in service of exploitation. Contemporary feminist analyses of the case emphasize how the sisters both benefited from and reinforced systems of gender oppression, serving as agents of patriarchal violence, even while operating within a male-dominated society that ultimately constrained their own opportunities and choices. Perhaps most importantly, the case continues to highlight how social inequality creates vulnerability to exploitation and violence. The Poquianchis were able to operate because they targeted people who were already marginalized and whose disappearance or suffering was unlikely to prompt serious investigation or response. The case demonstrates how poverty, discrimination, and social exclusion create the conditions in which such crimes become possible, explained sociologist Dr. Christina Bayon. Addressing these root causes is essential for preventing similar atrocities in the future. As we reflect on the Poquianchis case more than half a century after its discovery, several key lessons emerge that remain relevant for contemporary efforts to combat human trafficking, protect vulnerable populations, and build more just societies. The case demonstrates that terrible crimes can occur in plain sight if society chooses not to see them. The network of silence, complicity, and indifference that protected the Poquianchis for nearly 2 decades reminds us that preventing such atrocities requires active vigilance and willingness to act on uncomfortable truths. Evil thrives in darkness and silence, reflected one survivor in her final public statement. The most important lesson is that all of us have a responsibility to pay attention, to ask questions, and to act when we see signs that something is wrong. Individual prosecutions, while necessary, are insufficient to address crimes of this magnitude and complexity. The case reveals the need for comprehensive approaches that address corruption, social inequality, gender discrimination, and other structural factors that enable exploitation and violence. You can't solve systemic problems with individual solutions, argued legal scholar Dr. Sergio Garcia Ramirez. The Poquianchis case shows us that preventing such crimes requires transforming the social, economic, and political conditions that make them possible. Perhaps most importantly, the case demonstrates the crucial importance of listening to and supporting survivors. It was Catalina Ortega's courageous decision to speak out that finally brought the Poquianchis' empire of terror to an end, and it was the testimonies of survivors that provided the evidence necessary for conviction. Survivors are not just victims, emphasized victim rights advocate Ana Laura Magaloni. They are the heroes of these stories, the ones who maintain hope and seek justice against overwhelming odds. Supporting them is not just a moral obligation, it's also the most effective way to combat these kinds of crimes. The Poquianchis case reminds us that the struggle against human trafficking, gender-based violence, and social inequality is ongoing. While significant progress has been made since the 1962nd, the fundamental challenges of protecting vulnerable populations and building just societies remain. The case is both historical and contemporary, concluded human rights lawyer Carla Quintana. It's a reminder of how far we've come and how far we still have to go. The victims of the Poquianchis deserve to be remembered not just as symbols of human suffering, but as a call to action for continued vigilance and commitment to human dignity. In the end, the story of the Poquianchis is not just about 4 women who committed terrible crimes, or even about the specific historical circumstances that enabled those crimes. It is about the ongoing human struggle between good and evil, between those who would exploit and dehumanize others and those who resist such dehumanization. The dust may have settled over the ruins of the Loma del Ángel ranch, but the questions raised by what happened there continue to demand answers. In a world where human trafficking, gender-based violence, and exploitation of vulnerable populations persist, the voices of the victims and survivors of the Poquianchis continue to call out for justice, remembrance, and action. Their story serves as both a warning about the depths of human cruelty and a testament to the power of human resilience. It reminds us that the price of freedom and human dignity is eternal vigilance, and that the responsibility to protect the vulnerable belongs not just to authorities and institutions, but to each of us as members of the human community. The Poquianchis may be gone, but their legacy lives on in the ongoing struggle for justice, equality, and human rights. It is up to each generation to ensure that such horrors are never repeated and that the voices of their victims are never forgotten.